So it's something like 2001 and everyone's mostly recovered from certain unmentionable abominations. Seems like the perfect time to revisit Fire Emblem, and what better place for that than the latest portable console, especially after the success of a certain other strategy game on the console. That's right, it's time for Fire Emblem to go portable. It's interesting to note that there were some early plans for the 6th entry to be on the Nintendo 64, and there are some screenshots of the idea out there, but they ultimately decided on the GBA, and since they were doing it without their former director this time around, they decided to give the series a reboot in some sense, which is backed up by the new commercial.
Game Boy Advance.
This is Fire Emblem, the Binding Blade, the first of the 3 Game Boy Advance Fire Emblems. It's a pretty safe Fire Emblem in many ways, in that it's not overloading the game with a ton of new mechanics. In fact, very few of the mechanics in Thracia 776 return here. Rescue is still in, the weapon ranks are still letter grades that grow the more you use them, but skills aren't a thing anymore, capture isn't there, thieves can only steal items now, there's no fatigue, they got rid of movement and leadership stars, build and move don't increase at level up, the promotion items are back to different items for each class group being required, and cavalry units can only move again after non-combat actions. Ranged staves like the Warp Staff also went from having infinite range to having limited range based on the magic stat of the caster. Now all these mechanical nerfs actually made Binding Blade a controversial game for the English fanbase that existed at the time because they felt the game was being simplified for a wider audience. Meanwhile, Japan was loving this new entry for precisely the same reason. That, and there are a lot of callbacks to Mystery of the Emblem, a very beloved game over there. Binding Blade is set in the new continent of Ilib. A millennium ago, humans and dragons lived among each other in peace until war breaks out and 7 human warriors forge dragon-slaying weapons to take them on while Saint Elamine stands there and spams Fortify. The dragons are defeated and exiled from Ilib, while the 8 then went their separate ways and founded the 8 countries on the continent. But 1,000 years later, the country of Bern has started a war and aims to conquer all of Ilib. The protagonist, Roy, sets out to travel the continent, build an army, defeat Bern, and find out the truth behind its sudden invasion. It's a war story not as complicated as Genealogy, but just as epic as Fire Emblem 1, and with a lot of familiar yet refreshing plot elements. If any of this sounds similar to Mystery of the Emblem, well, it should. In addition to many characters sharing their looks and archetypes with the characters of that game, you can draw many allusions between Marth's story and Roy's. Naturally, you have a main lord that leads an army, wields a rapier at first, and later a legendary weapon that you need to get the true ending, red and green cavaliers, an early game paladin, a non-combatant advisor character, a stinking useless archer, the list goes on. King Zephiel of Bern can be compared to Emperor Hardin, Zephiel's sister Guinevere is a lot like Princess Nina, and many of the Bern generals are comparable to Camus, a boss you don't necessarily want to kill, but tragically you have no choice. Just about the biggest spin on the old formula is that your main character's hair is red instead of blue, and the fact that instead of Norse mythology we have heavy inspiration from A Song of Ice and Fire. I don't really mind it though, because this time the writers decided to flesh out the world a lot more through optional dialogue. Certain bosses sometimes engage in conversations with certain characters if they fight, though that's minor compared to a brand new mechanic, the support system. It's a successor of sorts to the lover system from Genealogy, but without the romance. If 2 compatible characters are next to each other for enough turns, they can have a support conversation. This is where the writing shines, because every compatible pair of characters has 3 unique conversations, and you can learn a lot about the characters, their history, and their personality only through these talks. Everyone's fleshed out a lot more. Gone are the days of one-note characters that are silent outside of their death quotes. Of course, it'd be crazy of me to suggest that every character is written perfectly well, Binding Blade sports the biggest cast of characters so far. When you're asked to write 15 or more conversations for every character, inevitably you're going to get a few that aren't interesting at all. I would say half the characters don't have all that interesting support conversations. I mean, look at the first Pegasus Knight you get. Half her talks are the others warning her to watch out for arrows. Jeez. Supports also have a gameplay application. In Mystery of the Emblem and Thracia 776, certain pairs of characters gain bonuses for being near each other. The support system gives you similar bonuses based on the elemental affinity of the characters involved, another new property. However, due to the massive number of turns required to build the supports, actually making use of this strategically is difficult. First time I got a conversation, it was because my Myrmidon was arena grinding with a compatible healer fixing him up every turn. If you want to get all the conversations, I would simply read them online instead. And the stat boosts you get from supports aren't critical to clearing the game either. Character balance is also weird in this game. One thing I noticed while playing this is that about half the characters are seriously powerful from a stat perspective, but the other half are really awful. The mounted healer you get is absolutely amazing, the cavaliers are amazing, your swordsmen are generally amazing, your wyverns can be amazing, but your archers are terrible as usual, your fighters are terrible, your armor knights are terrible, yet have their own triangle attack in addition to the Pegasus Knights for some reason. You've got tons of underleveled characters joining late in the game, and there are just so many units with really good or really bad stats sprinkled across the entire game. The large character casts are typically there in case too many people died and you need replacements, and those replacements are meant to be not as good, but in Binding Blade I can't really be sure if that's the idea. Part of this can be chalked up to the developers not really understanding the metagame of Fire Emblem, which admittedly didn't really start to seriously develop until people started doing low turn count playthroughs. I don't know, maybe they think archers and knights aren't all that bad if you're the type to take your time through each battle. This time around, the developers put together a campaign aiming for some high difficulty while keeping the system as fair as possible, unlike Thracia. This is the first game in which they roll two random numbers and average them together to determine accuracy checks, which leads to a lot more consistency. Usually. If you're unlucky enough to roll 102 times on your accuracy check, you just miss outright, even at 100 accuracy, because the check looks for a number less than your accuracy, not less than or equal to. You can Gen 1 miss in a Fire Emblem game. The combat preview now finally tells you the exact numbers on damage you'll inflict and hit chance, and for the first time in the entire franchise, finally you can determine where you want your units to begin each battle. As for map design, there's a definite improvement in level design over Thracia 776 and Mystery of the Emblem. However, the maps still retain a few artifacts from those days. There are quite a few maps bigger than they probably should be, side objectives tend to be out of the way, and enemy reinforcements still get to move on the same turn they spawn. This is the last game where that's the case, but the good news is they tend to throw in a warning or two that it's about to happen, so it's not as unfair as it sometimes feels. I'm not saying there aren't excellent maps in the game, that's very far from the truth, but you can still feel some of the common issues with the older games in these maps, since they're trying to retain the difficulty of said older games. Speaking of which, this is also the first Fire Emblem to introduce difficulty levels, unless you count Thracia 776 and Gaiden's double EXP modes. Beat the game once and you'll unlock a hard mode where the enemy stats skyrocket and turn a hard but fair challenge into a monstrous one. Don't worry though, you do get one concession. Any character that you encounter as an enemy will also get the stat boost the enemies have when they join you, and this is significant as some characters in this game that are normally not that worthy on normal mode turn into crazy fighters on hard mode. Binding Blade also introduces the Transporter class. From the second chapter onwards, you're in control of a transporter, which functions as the supply convoy, only it's mobile. At least it's easier to get weapons from it when you need it, but the issue is deploying him takes up a unit slot, which could have gone to another unit. You also don't need the transporter to send items to storage. There's also only one way for the transporter to level up, by being attacked 100 times. I'm dead serious. This feels like something out of Dark Dragon and the Sword of Light, but the transporter is also the only unit to not permanently die if he's killed. I guess they didn't want to turn him into the greatest meat shield there is. Actually, since Merlinus is a total pessimistic jerk in the storyline, it feels kind of nice to throw him at the enemy and watch him squirm. Binding Blade also switches up the magic system, though I'm kinda on the fence regarding how they handle it. Fire, thunder, and wind have all been condensed into one type of magic, which I think is fine. However, way back in Mystery of the Emblem, there were many elements of spells, even with only one magic type, that would do extra damage to certain enemies. Here, this only applies to the one wind spell in the game, which I think is a bit of a lost opportunity. A big issue here is that they don't really differentiate the three types of magic that much. Dark magic has Rosier/Nosferatu, light magic is more accurate but less powerful, and anima magic is just kind of the middle ground. Binding Blade definitely handles dark magic better, but light magic is very odd in that it's restricted to bishops only, which promote from clerics. Clerics are notoriously slow to level up because the EXP from healing has been reduced, and they also don't have mounts like the troubadour you get, so I rarely ever get to use light magic in Binding Blade. It's all very odd, but I think I can live with it. I'm just not sure why there would be multiple magic types and a magic triangle with weird restrictions on one type and limited variety on the others. Yet again, the game ranks your playthrough at the end, this time with the most complicated ranking system so far. In fact, it's probably way too complicated since the categories are not that difficult to satisfy. Turn count, character depth, and experience and levels gained all factor into the rankings just like genealogy. Binding Blade adds in the funds ranking, which is based on the value of all remaining inventory items and the gold you've amassed combined. Since selling an item only gives you half the item's value in gold, selling an item means you actually lose money as far as the rankings are concerned, unless that gold is spent by a unit carrying the silver card, which lets you buy items at half price. You're also ranked on what percentage of fights you get into result in a KO. This is easy enough to satisfy because by the end of the game, you're one-rounding most enemies. Besides turn count and experience, a lot of the ranking categories feel somewhat arbitrary. Side quests also return in this game. Now, if you got a side quest in Thracia 776, you had no choice but to take it. Here you get an offer to play them if you meet the requirements. Depending on who's playing, however, the side quests in this game could be considered mandatory. Every side quest in Binding Blade nets you one of the setting's legendary weapons, which require the highest weapon rank of that type to wield and slay dragons in an instant. Like Mystery of the Emblem, there are extra chapters and an alternate ending if you fulfill a certain requirement after beating the final boss. In this game, that's collecting all 9 legendary weapons and the Divine Dragonstone and keeping them all intact by the end. If one of them breaks, no alternate ending, even if you clear the side quest. Oh, and you can change the ending again if Roy gets the kill on the true final boss with his own legendary weapon. Something's odd about all this, but I don't really mind it. Oh, and can we talk graphics for a minute? I didn't bring up graphics in the previous reviews because you can see for yourself that the animations and such were pretty alright for their time. However, I need to give special mention to the GBA animations. They are awesome. Every hit feels like it has weight to it, especially critical hits. In the Super Nintendo games, there were some cool animations, but Binding Blade gave us so many epic battle animations. It's crazy. Like the mercenary animation. The guy tosses his sword in the air, catches it, and lands on the enemy for the critical. Archers and snipers twirl their arrows before firing, which I find amusing, and this game's Monarchy doesn't just breathe fire on her enemies, she sneezes it at them. It's too adorable! This is also the first Fire Emblem to introduce some form of post-game. There are unlockable trial maps available if you beat the game. These basically offer extra challenges for the characters you built up in the main story. There's not really a lot to say about them since you just play them with no plot attached, but I suppose that's okay for anyone who wanted a little more content. We also have, for the first time, a multiplayer mode. The Link Arena is a new mode that lets you take your characters, pit them against a friend's team, and take turns attacking them like it's a JRPG instead of playing an actual strategy game battle. What the heck? Advance Wars did multiplayer just fine. Why are we stuck with this in Fire Emblem? Oh well, I don't imagine multiplayer had a lot going for it anyways due to the sheer number of dice rolls that still exist. Accuracy, crits, growths, and this mode doesn't change at all in the next 2 games either, sadly. What's also curious is that this game is actually not Roy's first game appearance. Roy was actually in Super Smash Bros. Melee, the Nintendo Battle Royale crossover game, before his actual game came out, probably as an advertising move. Fire Emblem must have been waning in popularity, I guess. He and Marth appear in Smash Bros. As very powerful sword fighters, and luckily they weren't cut from the English version like they were contemplating, because I know a lot of US players only knew of Fire Emblem because of these two. There was also a tie-in manga known as The Champion's Blade. This manga takes place in the same setting as Binding Blade, but with some new characters traveling the continent and encountering characters from Binding Blade. Eventually, they fall in with Roy's army and the game's plot takes over from there. The new characters aren't mentioned in the game aside from 3 weapons bearing their names: Al's sword, Gant's lance, and Tina's staff. Shamefully, they're all pretty generic items. Overall, I'd consider Binding Blade a pretty solid entry in the Fire Emblem series, and it proves Intelligent Systems knows what they're doing, even without He Who Shall Not Be Named. Binding Blade still has yet to be released in the West in some form, however, which is very odd considering that the next game, Blazing Sword, is a prequel to this, and that game was actually the first to make it outside Japan. We'll be taking a look at that installment next time.